In our lesson today, we're going to be continuing our series on the book of James. We've been going through this book, taking about half a chapter at a time, and we're at the 8th lesson here in our series. And we're going to be looking at the second half of James chapter 4. And as we've studied the book of James, what we've seen is that he's talking about very practical ways that we are to put our faith into practice. And what he discusses in the passage we'll be looking at here today in our lesson is about planning, about looking to the future and making preparations for what may be coming in the future. It's something that is an important topic for us to think about and to discuss and to plan for. So that's what we're going to be talking about today as we look at James chapter 4, the second half of James chapter 4, and see what it looks like for a Christian who is walking by faith, living by faith, how we look toward the future. And so as we look at this passage, we're going to see that he starts by explaining to us that planning is just a part of life. We see in chapter 4 of James, verses 13 through 15, he says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will also live, and we will live and also do this or that." So James here is introducing this idea of planning. He talks about making plans, and specifically he talks about making business plans here. We'll go to such and such a city, we'll spend a year there, we'll engage in business and make a profit. The principle, though, really applies to any type of planning that we might do. It could be planning for our family, for our home, for different projects that we might have. We have different types of plans that we make in this life. And so all of these would apply in principle to what he's talking about here in this passage where he mentions, well, we're going to go to this city, we're going to spend a year there, engage in business, and make a profit. All the types of plans that we are engaged in would fall into the discussion here of what he's talking about planning, and this is a basic part of life. The wise man said over in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9, and the reason why we're going to the book of Proverbs, and we're going to notice a couple passages here, is because as James is talking about very practical ways we put our faith into practice, the book of Proverbs talks about in very practical terms what it looks like to walk in wisdom, to follow after the wisdom that God has revealed to us. And so there are a lot of similarities between what Proverbs says, what the book of Proverbs says, and what James wrote about. And so the book of Proverbs, we see different things about planning, and it presents it as a very natural and necessary part of life. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9, it says, "The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." We're going to be engaged in planning. We're going to be doing things like that and trying to make preparations for the future. In chapter 19 and verse 21, it says, "Many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand." We have plans, we make preparations, we have all of these ideas and goals, and we are working towards something. That's a natural part of life. And it is wise to make plans. These passages do not tell us, and James is not telling us, don't make plans, or you shouldn't make plans, that it's contrary to a life of faith to plan for the future. No, we need to make plans. Proverbs 20 and verse 5 says, "A plan in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding draws it out." If we have understanding, if we have wisdom, what we're going to do is not just, well, we have a plan somewhere rolling around inside our head, but we are going to draw that out. We're going to put it into practice. We're going to be diligent in carrying it out, just as he said in Proverbs 21 and verse 5. "The plans of the diligent lead surely to an advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty." Rather than pursuing some crazy get-rich-quick scheme, work hard. Do the best job you can. Exercise wisdom. And make preparations, make plans, and work towards those goals. This is a natural part of life, whether we're talking about our business or our home or our family or whatever it might be. Even plans that we might make within the local church in that context. Planning is a natural part of life. And it is wise to do it. It is necessary to do it, and we are to be diligent in carrying out those plans. However, James also explained there in this passage that life is uncertain, that we are a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. We don't know what will happen. We don't know when things are going to happen. The wise man said in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 7, if no one knows what will happen, who can tell him when it will happen? We can make plans, we can make preparations, but life is uncertain. However, the fact that life is uncertain does not give us permission or license to worry about what's going to come and worry about where our life is headed or what might be happening to us in the future. Jesus said over in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 34, not to worry about tomorrow. And tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Don't worry about what's coming. Don't worry about what the future holds. Plan for it, but we can't worry about it because this uncertainty is going to be a reality. We cannot plan for everything. And as we make plans, James says here in these verses that we just read, we need to remember God. Instead of just saying, well, we're going to go to this city and spend a year there, engage in business and make a profit, he says, instead, what you ought to say is, if the Lord wills, we will live and then also do this or that. This is a reminder for us that we need to follow the will of God. Just as we read in those passages in the book of Proverbs, we make plans, that we make preparations, we move to a certain direction, we have goals, we have these decisions that we make, but we need to allow the Lord to direct our steps. We need to remember that His counsel will stand. We might make plans, but God's will does not change. His plans do not change. We need to humble ourselves before Him and allow Him to direct our steps. That's what we all need to do. So we have to make plans. Planning is a part of life, but we need to remember it in this context. So then he talks about, and really a part of that verse, that passage we already read, or the portion of this passage that we already read, he said in verse 14, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. James explains to us that life is short. We are a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. We've already talked about this fact that life is uncertain. That passage in Ecclesiastes 8:7, if no one knows what will happen, who can tell him when it'll happen? No matter how much we are diligent in trying to plan and prepare and try to figure out what might happen and be prepared with whatever possibilities might come before us, despite our best efforts to plan for the future, we simply cannot know what the future holds with certainty. But one thing is certain in our future. Death is certain. Hebrews 9:27 says it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes the judgment. Now this is not usually a pleasant thing to think about, but it is a reality. It is something that we do need to recognize. It is going to happen. Ecclesiastes 7:2 talks about how it is better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting, because this is the end of every man, and the living take it to heart. We need to take this to heart. We need to recognize that we are here for a short time. Our life is a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. The psalmist said over in Psalm 90 and verse 10 that the days of our life, 70 years, if by reason of strength, 80 years, but they are soon gone and we fly away. That's still generally true. It's not an absolute rule, but it is generally true. We might live 70 or 80 years. Sure, there are exceptions to that. Some people live longer. Many people who don't live that long. But that's a general rule, 70 or 80 years. That's about really what we have here. And for those who are young, that may seem like a long time. If someone is 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old, and they look ahead to someone who is 70 years old, 80 years old, or they try to picture themselves being that old, that may seem like such a long way off. But the older that we get, and this is true for all of us, the older that we get, the more we realize and appreciate the brevity of life. We have an example over in Genesis chapter 47 when Jacob and the rest of his family came to Egypt because of the famine. Joseph, his son, had already been sold into slavery in Egypt, but then through God's help had risen to power, was assisting Pharaoh, and was in charge of making sure all of the food was distributed and everything was taken care of. Well, Jacob and the rest of the family comes to Egypt. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, had an opportunity to meet with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh evidently was impressed by Jacob simply because of the fact that he knew he was an older man and that he had lived a long time. And so he asked him about this, and he asked him how old he was. And he said that the years of his life at that point were 130 years. He lived about 17 years after that. But at that point, 130 years. Now, if we were alive today and we were 70 or 80 years old, we'd think, well, that's a long time. We don't know, at least as far as the Bible record says, we don't know how old Pharaoh was. But 130 years would have been impressive. He would have been looking up to Jacob as the elder. So this would have been something that would have been impressive to him. He might be wondering, well, how could I live that long? But Jacob said that few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, or the years of my sojourn. When he was looking at it from his perspective, he knew that his years were few. Even though from everyone else's perspective, it would have seemed like such a long time that he was alive. The more we age, the more we appreciate this, that life is short. And not only is death going to come, but it is going to come suddenly and unexpectedly. Over in the book of Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, it describes the process of aging and the different things that happen to someone in the first few verses of chapter 12, about how one's hearing begins to go, his eyes begin to grow dim, and all of these different things happen. And so there's an aging process, and we see our body wearing out. And those who, especially as we get advanced in age, that this is something that's apparent. But notice how it's described here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. At the end of this description, of all these descriptions about how our body is aging and wearing out, he said in verses 6 and 7, "Remember him before the silver cord is broken, and the golden bowl is crushed, and the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed." He's describing the things that happen instantly. That maybe there was pressure on them, maybe other things were falling apart, but this happens instantly. "Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." Death is something that even though we know it's coming, and even if we can see or feel our body wearing out, it's still something that comes suddenly and in some ways unexpectedly. We don't put this on the schedule. We plan and we schedule all sorts of things in life. We don't schedule this. We don't schedule death. We know it's coming, but we don't know when it's coming. And so because of that, James continues and explains that we are not to boast. He said in verse 16, "But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil." It is arrogant to assume that we have more control over our lives than we do. In our lesson last week, when we talked about the rich man, the parable of the rich man, we saw Jesus described him as one who was going to tear down his barns and build larger ones. And we talked about it last week, that his plans in and of themselves were not necessarily wrong. His heart was wrong. The fact that he had forgotten God and his spiritual well-being, that was wrong. But he planned to do all of these things. But he said, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And Jesus said that he was a fool, because that night his soul was required of him. He thought he was in control. He thought that, well, I can take care of this now, and then later, then I'll concern myself with my spiritual well-being. Well, he wasn't completely in control. And as we look at ourselves, we need to recognize that there are a lot of things that are simply beyond our control. And sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking we have more control than we do. But there are a lot of things that are simply outside of our control. But James talks about we boast like this, and all such boasting is evil. The reason why he described it as evil, when we think we can make plans and we're not going to be affected by all of these changes or all of this uncertainty, if we think we're not affected by that, if we think we can't be a victim to things happening outside of our control that completely ruin our plans, then we are in essence putting ourselves in the place of God. God is not one who his plans are going to be overthrown. But if we think that, well, nothing can happen, I'm completely in control, I know what's going to happen, I know I have everything planned for, when we get in that position, then we essentially put ourselves in the place of God. There's a passage over in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 28, where the king of Tyre was condemned by God and was warned that judgment was coming against him because of this attitude. Because of this attitude that said that, well, nothing's going to affect me. He said there in Ezekiel 28 verse 2, because your heart is lifted up and you have said, I am a God, I sit in the seat of gods, in the heart of the seas. And then God said to him, yet you are a man and not God, although you make your heart like the heart of God. He fooled himself into thinking that he was like God, and God knew that you're not God. You are a man and not God. Judgment was coming against him. He was going to be overthrown. Eventually he was going to be killed. And it says later in that passage, will you still say that you are a God in the presence of your slayer? When someone comes, and as your enemies come against you, and someone who is going to take your life comes before you, are you still going to stand there and claim that, well, I'm a God, nothing can affect me? No, you're not going to do that. It's going to be very apparent then, but it's going to be too late then. But when we make plans and we think that, well, nothing can affect this, I'm completely in control, we're essentially making ourselves like God. That's why he says that all such boasting is evil. And again, going back to the lesson that we talked about last week with the rich man and the parable of the rich man that Jesus gave, not only is this evil, it is foolish. You fool, this night your soul will be required of you. But when we think about the plans that we might make and how we think we're in control, we look at some plans in the book of Psalms, Psalm 2. You have plans that people made against God, thinking that they could overthrow God. They were not going to be bound by his law and by his will, and that they could overthrow God. This is really a prophecy of Christ, that they thought they could put him to death and then they would not have to serve him. They would not be in subjection to him. Notice what it says over here in Psalm 2, beginning in verse 1. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed one, or against his Christ, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. So this is their plan. And what they did with Jesus, they crucified him. Notice verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. And he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. So here's an example, and there's another passage on the screen there in Psalm 37 that makes the same point. But you have these examples of people making plans against God, against the people of God, against, here in Psalm 2, the Lord's anointed, against Christ. They make plans against him. Those plans are not going to come to fruition. God sits in heaven and laughs at their plans because he is in control. We are not in control. He is in control. And so even if we're not making plans that we are deliberately scheming and trying to overthrow God, it's the same idea when we make plans and we ignore God. We ignore the fact that we are not in control over everything. God is in heaven. God sees all this and sees us, like the rich man in Jesus' parable, as foolish because we think we're in control when there are so many things that are outside of our control. So what do we need to do then? We need to make sure that we're doing what is right. Verse 17, he says, Therefore to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. God has revealed his will to us in his word, and he expects us to know his word and to do his word. Notice a couple verses from chapter 1 that we studied earlier in this study. In James chapter 1, verse 19, he said, This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. We want to be listening. We need to be listening, have our ears open. Verse 21 says, Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. Be listening and receive the word implanted into your heart. God wants us to hear his word and to know his word. And then, verse 22, prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. Hear it, know it, believe it, and then do it or practice it. God has revealed his word to us so that we will know it and do it. And we sin when we fail to do what he has instructed us to do. The one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. God's revealed it to us. God has shown us what he wants us to do, but we don't do it. We fall short of the glory of God, as Romans 3:23 says. We sin. But when we sin, we are not to make excuses for why we failed to do what is right, because often we want to do that. We want to make excuses. We know the right thing to do, but we don't do it. Well, why don't we do it? Well, we have an excuse for that. We don't need to look for excuses or make excuses. Instead, we need to do what is right. We've been talking about planning and how this is a natural part of life or a necessary part of life. At the same time, it is possible for planning where we just are going through everything and thinking through everything, but we just keep going through it over and over. Or planning is just another form of procrastination. That we think that, well, we'll do what's right, but we're not going to do it now. We're going to do it later. I've planned to do it. I've planned to do it some other time. The wise man in Jesus' parable, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. I'll think about that later. Or when Paul was preaching to Felix, and he sent Paul away, he says, when I find time or when I have a convenient season, then I will call for you. I'll listen to you, but not now. I'll listen later. I'll think about your message later. Maybe I'll follow it, but not now. We might plan to do something later, but really all we're doing is we're putting it off because we don't want to do it. When it comes to doing the will of God, we don't plan to do it later. We just do it. That's what we need to do. We just do the will of God. And because our time is short, we especially need to make sure that we are not putting it off, that we are doing it. But also, time being short does not mean we should justify in our minds neglecting to do what is good. We think about what God has instructed us to do, what He's called us to do. And then we make excuses that, well, I couldn't do it because I just didn't have time to do it. Time is short. I didn't have time to do this. I have all of these other things to do. Well, we do have all kinds of things to do. But we need to make sure our priorities are in order. We need to make the most of our time, as Ephesians 5 and verse 16 says, because the days are evil. We have a lot to do. We have all sorts of things that are pulling us in different directions. But that doesn't justify failing to do what God has told us to do. We know the right thing to do, but we don't do it, then it is sin. So rather than making excuses, we simply need to do what the Lord wants us to do. He's told us in His Word what He expects of us. So let's not think that, well, I'll plan to do it later. Or, well, life is short and time is short, I can't do it. No, don't make excuses. Just do what God has told us, has instructed us to do. So as we bring this lesson to a close, we see that planning for the future is a necessary part of life. We can't get around this. But we, in making plans, have to make sure that we're doing this according to the will of God. Remember what God expects us to do. Remember what He's instructed us to do in His Word, and then do it. Don't neglect or fail to carry out His will. Simply do what He has called us to do. And remember that life is short. We cannot allow the things of this life, everything that is pulling us in different directions, don't allow that to interfere from what is truly important. Because there are other things that we ought to be doing that are more important than just the unnecessary things of this life that are so easily distracting to us. Time is short. We need to make sure that we are using our time wisely, making plans wisely, but always doing it with God in mind, remembering that we are accountable to Him. We will answer to Him. He's given us this time that we have now. We need to make sure we're using it wisely. We need to make sure that in our plans we remember Him. And in whatever we do, whatever circumstances we face, let's make sure we're doing the will of God and making preparations for meeting Him at the end of our life whenever that comes, because we don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know what the future holds. But we do know we have a responsibility to follow the Lord. So whatever happens in the future, whatever plans we make, and whatever happens that derails our plans, let's make sure then whatever we do, we are striving to faithfully serve the Lord.